Good morning, welcome to Stoked for Bible study. My wife sat on my hat yesterday, so I don't have my hat anymore. So I guess I'll just have to go through this video without a hat. Anyway, this video is about the Gospel of Luke. I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, let's just get into the video. It's pretty obvious that both Luke and Acts are written by the same author because of the way the two books start. Both are written to Theophilus, and Acts refers to an earlier work, which pretty obviously is the Gospel of Luke. The name of the author doesn't appear in either of the books, but there is a section in Acts where the author starts using personal pronouns. This section corresponds with when Paul were joined by Luke the physician. This Luke is mentioned a couple times in Paul's letter, and he is clearly faithful to Paul and his teachings. Luke was a well-educated Greek convert, and he wrote excellent Greek. The purpose of writing this gospel is described in chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. To write an orderly account that you may have certainty in the things you have been taught. This does not help us too much, however. Why did Theophilus need a written down account in the first place? And who even is Theophilus? This is the only gospel that clearly states its recipient, a man named Theophilus. Although Theophilus means beloved by God, this does not mean that it's not a real person. The name Theophilus was a pretty common name in the Roman Empire. Luke addresses him as most excellent, which means that he was probably of higher social class. The name Theophilus could both be a Gentile name and the name of a Jew living outside of Palestine. But since Luke has to explain some of the Jewish customs, he is most likely a Gentile. We do not know if Theophilus is a Christian or not. Some have suggested that he is the patron or the financial supporter of this work being written. Others have suggested that he might be a judge or a lawyer, because it seems like Luke Acts may have been written as a defense of Christians or of Paul. Because Acts ends in a very abrupt way, it would make sense that Luke was just writing up to the point in history where he was. If Luke and Acts were written after the death of Paul, why not mention it? Or why not mention the death of Peter? Luke spends a lot of time on the last appeal of Paul to Caesar, so why not mention the outcome of that appeal if it has already happened? Therefore, I believe that Luke and Acts were written in Rome while Paul was in Rome waiting for his trial, which was around 62 AD. In both Luke and Acts, Christians are on trial several times. And every time Christians are on trial in Acts, they're found not guilty. When Jesus was on trial, both Herod and Pilate said that he was innocent. Therefore, it would make sense that this work is written as a defense of Paul or just Christians in general. So that is the view that I hold. Of course, there are other theories out there, but at the end of the day, we have no idea who Theophilus is or why Luke was writing to him. If this book is written as a defense of Paul, it would be helpful to know why Paul is on trial in the first place. In the time of Jesus and the early church, the ruling authorities were the Romans. The Jewish council had some authority in Jerusalem, but it was limited. For instance, the Jews could not sentence anyone to death unless if a Gentile entered the temple. Both Jesus and Paul was mostly just persecuted by Jews until the persecution under Nero, which we talked about in the previous video about Mark. So why is Paul on trial before Caesar? To really understand what's happening, we need some more background information. Before the Jews were under the authority of the Romans, they had been independent for a little while. The Jews had managed at what is called the Maccabean Revolt to fight off the Greeks in a pretty miraculous way, which was the previous world power. And they had their independence for about 100 years until the Romans came and took over. But in the process of taking over Judea, the Romans agreed to not demand the Jews to sacrifice to the Roman gods or to the emperor, as long as they sacrificed on behalf of the emperor in the temple. The Jews were the only exception to this rule, and everyone else had to worship the emperor. At the start of the early church, the Christians were not demanded to worship the emperor because they were considered a Jewish group. But the Jews didn't agree with this, and they wanted to stop the Christians. The Romans, for the most part, didn't really care about the Christians because they considered it an argument over Jewish law. So why was Paul on trial before the Romans in the first place? First of all, they would do anything not to stir up a riot. The Romans wanted to keep the peace in the empire as best as they could, and if a riot occurred, it wasn't only the people making the riot that was in trouble. The Romans could also step in and punish the local authorities for not keeping the peace. So when Jesus was on trial before both Herod and Pilate, they both considered him innocent, but they still executed him because they were afraid of riots. And when Paul entered into Jerusalem, the Jews were pretty mad at him, so the Romans took him into prison not to cause a riot. There's also the fact that the Jews were pretty keen on a rebellion against the Romans in the first place, and when the Romans would hear of a little Jewish group that proclaimed another king and another kingdom, that could sound like a rebellion to them. I'll talk more about Paul and his trial and all of that when we come to the book of Acts. So what is the point of Luke writing the story about Jesus as a defense for Paul? Luke wants to show what Jesus is all about and how he's not a criminal and he is not a threat to the Romans. The Christians that were following him were not a violent group, they were rather a positive social group that was caring for the outcasts and the poor and the needy. There's one theme that stands out pretty much everywhere you look in this book. And when I'm talking about poor, I'm not only talking about the people that don't have money, it can also include everyone with a lower social status. That includes women, children, tax collectors, prostitutes, sick people, lepers, anyone that is not of high social rank. And it is interesting that the one thing we know about Theophilus is that he was of high social status, and that the one big theme in this book is how Jesus came to the poor. I don't know why that is. Your guess is as good as mine. If we look at Luke and Acts together, it is pretty clear that Luke moves from the areas outside of Jerusalem into Jerusalem, while Acts moves from Jerusalem to the end of the world, or just Rome. So the whole structure of Luke is just moving towards Jerusalem. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is where Jesus is in Galilee. He is born in Bethlehem and goes to Jerusalem a couple of times, but he is mostly in Galilee. Then in 951, Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem. So part 2 is about Jesus' journey towards Jerusalem. In this section, Jesus will tell a bunch of parables, and this is mostly about the teaching of Jesus. Then in 1911, Jesus draws near to Jerusalem and tells a parable about a servant that is not faithful with what he is given. 10 servants are giving 10 minas. 1 mina is about 3 months' wages. The master of the servants gives them the money so they can invest it and make it grow. One of the servants hid the money away and didn't dare to do anything about the money until the master returned. The master rewarded the people that had invested the money, and he punished the one that hid them away. This parable starts the 3rd and final section of the book. It's all about how the Jewish leaders had not stewarded the gift that they had been given, and how God is going to take it away from them. So they had rejected their responsibility of being God's people, and God was not going to ignore that. So the last part is about Jesus in Jerusalem, how he rejects the Jewish leaders and how he eventually is crucified by them. But let's back up and look at the 3 parts a little bit closer. The first 3 chapters are about baby Jesus and John the Baptist. Luke spends a lot of time on this section. Mark and John doesn't spend any time on this at all, and Matthew just focuses on Jesus' birth, but not as detailed as Luke does. This might be because Luke is writing an historical account, and the birth of Jesus is a pretty important part in the history of Jesus. But it might also be to establish the humanity of Jesus. In Greek culture, there was this thought that everything physical was bad and everything spiritual was good. So it would be hard to understand that Jesus was an actual human being. Jesus' humanity will be very clear in this gospel. Jesus' family will be in focus, Jesus growing in wisdom, Jesus' feelings, how he cries, he's moved, he sympathizes, and he's angry. Jesus is clearly God in this gospel too, but it just focuses more on Jesus' humanity than the other gospels does. You might also notice how much focus there is on John the Baptist in this section. And I can't really say I know why this is. Maybe Theophilus was curious about him. Maybe he was wondering why he was executed. Maybe there were rumors about John the Baptist swirling around the Roman Empire that Luke wanted to clarify. But at the end of the day, there's no way to actually know. After the first 3 chapters, Jesus starts his ministry. After being tempted in the desert, Jesus goes into a synagogue and preaches from a text in Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering the sight of the blind, and set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This seems to be Jesus' main mission in this book, to bring good news to the poor and proclaim liberty to the captives. This is, as I already said, not just people without money, but people with lower social status. Jesus came to turn everything upside down and exalt the humble. Then Jesus goes around and does his thing. He heals people, he preaches, and people start following him. He chooses his 12 disciples, which mainly consists of lower class people, mostly fishermen. Jesus also calls a tax collector to follow him, Levi or Matthew. Tax collectors were seen as traitors because they were working for the Romans. He also called a zealot. The zealots were a group of people that wanted to fight against the Romans, so it would be pretty interesting to be in this group. After Jesus has shown his disciples more of who he is and has been transfigured before them, he sets his mind towards going to Jerusalem. Jesus has of course been in Jerusalem multiple times before, so it's not just to visit the city or anything like that, but it is him going towards his own death. It is in this section that Jesus tells most of his parables. Some of these parables are used in sermons every Sunday around the world. Others are totally ignored because they're just super confusing. I obviously don't have time to go through all of these parables with you, but I will give you some helpful tips to read parables. When we read the parables, we usually start to read where the parable starts, and we kind of just read it as a random wisdom teaching that Jesus has and that he tells to everyone. And we try to take out every single detail to find some meaning behind it. If you do this, you probably read too much into it. So here are some tips to help you read the parables better. Number 1, look at the context. The parables are there for a reason, and the reason is pretty clear if you just look at the context around the parable. Like in Luke 13, there's a parable about a fig tree that is to be cut down if it doesn't produce any fruit. What does this actually mean? Well, look at what he says before he tells the parable. He tells some of his followers that unless they repent from their sin, they will perish. So like the fig tree that didn't bear fruit, so the follower of Jesus that didn't bear the fruit of repentance will also be cut down. Number 2, who is he talking to? If you want to understand the parables of Jesus, you need to understand who Jesus is talking to. Some of his parables are specific to the 12 disciples, some are to all of his followers, and some are to the religious leaders, so the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So look at Luke chapter 15 and a parable of the prodigal son. We keep focusing on the son that ran away and came back, and yes, that is the answer to the question that the Pharisees had: why does he eat with sinners? But this parable is not told to the sinners at the table so that they would return to God. It is told to the Pharisees so that they don't become like the brother that is not happy for the brother that came back because he thought he was entitled to the whole kingdom. And number 3, don't get too caught up on details. While some details can be powerful and helpful to you on a personal level, don't try to give everything a meaning. If you're trying to figure out what the pig in the story of the prodigal son is symbolizing, you're looking too far into it. The parables have one clear point that they are communicating. Sometimes there's even several parables that just tell one clear point. So don't try to read too much into it. Not everything is symbolic and meant to be interpreted. The last part is about Jesus in Jerusalem. I already talked a little bit about this earlier in the video, but the message of Jesus to Jerusalem isn't really a good one. The Jewish leaders had their chance and spoiled it by not acting the way God's people are supposed to act. Jesus foretells the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Of course, the Jewish leaders weren't too fond of this message and they wanted to get Jesus killed. Jesus is betrayed by one of his own, but even as he is captured, he shows mercy to his captors by healing one of them. And notice that both Pilate and Herod thinks that Jesus is innocent. Jesus was not executed because he did anything wrong. It was because the Roman authorities wanted to keep the peace from the people that wanted him dead. The story of Jesus is not about a criminal that got what he deserved. It's about a man that was wrongfully executed. He didn't start any rebellions, but he turned the world upside down by saying that the poor should be exalted and the humble should be honored. Even in his resurrection, who does he appear to? Women. If you want someone who can give a credible witness at this time, you don't pick women. For whatever reason, a woman's testimony was a little worth, but Jesus chose to appear to them anyway. Then he appears to more of his people before he is ascended to heaven, and the rest of the story of the early church continues in Acts. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. He came to lift up the poor and exalt the humble. I think it's our job today to continue his mission in the world. We should look for the poor and the needy and look after them. Even if it is inconvenient to us, we should go above and beyond to help those who need our help. What does that look like practically in your life? Maybe if you know someone who needs help, stretch out your hand and help them where it's needed. Or maybe it's just supporting a charity. I don't think you have to look very far to find someone who is hurting in some way. Don't ignore them, help them. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. And you can also support me financially on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Thank you.